The sound came before the fear, a deep, rattling boom that rolled across the black water like the growl of something alive, something hunting. Nelson froze, his breath catching in his throat as the deck beneath him trembled. For a moment he thought the darkness itself had cracked open. But the night offered no answers, only the cold sting of wind and the uneasy creak of timbers shifting under strain. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not alone. Not at this hour. Lanterns had been extinguished long ago, leaving the ship wrapped in a silence that felt unnatural, as if the entire crew were holding its breath with him. A thick fog hovered above the sea, muting every sound except the slow pulse of waves slapping against the hull. Nelson leaned over the rail, straining to see what had stirred the water with such force. Nothing. Only an endless black sheet, stretching toward a horizon he could no longer distinguish. Another tremor vibrated through the planks. This one softer, but deliberate, like a hand tapping from beneath. Nelson swallowed hard. Even as a young midshipman, barely old enough to be trusted with a blade, he knew the sea was full of dangers that did not announce themselves with clarity. Ships vanished. Men vanished. A single mistake, a moment's hesitation, and the ocean would claim you without leaving behind even a whisper. A distant shout drifted through the mist. Nelson spun around, but no figure emerged. The voice sounded strained, half-formed, as if it were being dragged away by the wind before it could fully reach him. He waited, listening. His pulse thudded against his ribs. Again, the voice came, closer this time, urgent, warning. But the words dissolved before he could grasp them. He stepped back from the rail, forcing himself to breathe evenly. The officers had dismissed the strange vibrations earlier in the evening as shifting currents and ordinary movement of the hull. But Nelson felt something else. A pressure in the air, a heaviness he couldn't explain. It wasn't just the sea behaving oddly, it was the silence aboard the ship. Men who were usually restless at night lay still in their hammocks, muttering in their sleep or staring upward with wide, uncertain eyes. Even the seasoned sailors, the ones with weathered skin and voices like gravel, had paused before turning in, exchanging glances that revealed more anxiety than their words admitted. Nelson had sensed the tension before sunset. He felt it while coiling ropes, while scrubbing down the deck, while listening to the creak of rigging as the ship adjusted to the changing wind. It clung to the crew like a film of sweat, an unspoken question hanging over every movement. What is waiting out there? And more importantly, when will it show itself? The fog thickened suddenly, swallowing the bow of the ship in pale gray. Nelson backed into the shadow of the mainmast, his fingers brushing its rough surface. The air grew colder. He could no longer see the faint outline of the horizon. The ship seemed to be drifting inside a void, cut off from the rest of the world. Even the stars had vanished. Then, footsteps. Soft, hurried, coming from the lower deck. Nelson's hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt. No sailor should have been moving at this hour unless ordered. He pressed himself closer to the mast and held his breath as the footsteps approached the ladder. A figure emerged, tall, cloaked in darkness, the faint glow of fog outlining only its shape. Nelson tried to speak, but his throat tightened. The figure paused, turning its head slowly toward him. For an instant, the silence became unbearable, stretched tight like a rope ready to snap. "Midshipman," the figure whispered. Relief washed through him, the voice belonged to an officer. But before Nelson could greet him, the man stepped closer, gripping his shoulder with a trembling hand. His face came into view, illuminated by the dull reflection of fog and starlight. He looked pale, shaken. A sheen of sweat glistened on his brow. "You felt it too, didn't you?" the officer murmured. "The ship, it's not alone tonight." Nelson didn't answer. He didn't need to. The officer's expression told him everything. This wasn't imagination. It wasn't some odd shift of the hull or the restless muttering of a crew exhausted from days at sea. Something was out there. The officer released him and glanced over the rail with a haunted intensity. "The captain thinks it's the French," he said quietly. "But the men below, they're saying it's something older." He lowered his voice further, leaning in until Nelson felt his breath on his cheek. "Something that doesn't belong on the surface." Before Nelson could respond, another boom tore through the night, louder, closer, impossible to ignore. The deck lurched, sending both of them stumbling. A chorus of startled cries erupted from below. Lanterns swung. Ropes snapped against the masts. The officer grabbed Nelson's arm, pulling him upright. "Get to the quarterdeck," he ordered. "Now!" But Nelson hesitated. The fog was moving, not drifting, not rolling, moving, spiraling in deliberate patterns across the water as if stirred by something beneath. Shapes shifted within it, long shadows, rising and falling, vanishing before he could fully see them. His heart hammered. Something brushed the underside of the hull with a scraping sound that vibrated through his bones. Men began pouring onto the deck, scrambling for orders that had not yet been given. Panic spread quickly, filling the air with frantic voices. Someone shouted for the captain. Another yelled that the anchor was dragging. A third insisted he saw a figure rising out of the water. Nelson didn't know where to look. Every sense screamed a different warning. The ship felt surrounded, boxed in by unseen forces inching closer with each passing second. The fog pulsed again, glowing faintly, as if lit from beneath. And for the first time in his short life at sea, Horatio Nelson felt something colder than fear. The undeniable certainty that whatever was out there had just found them. The first scream didn't sound human. It ripped through the fog like metal tearing, sharp enough to freeze every man where he stood. Nelson spun toward the sound, but the wall of mist swallowed everything beyond a few paces. The deck trembled again, more violently this time, as if something massive had collided with the hull from below. He reached instinctively for the rail, fingers slipping against the wet wood, heart pounding so fiercely it drowned out the shouts around him. The ship was alive with panic. Men rushed in every direction, boots hammering the planks, lanterns swinging wildly as shadows leapt and twisted across the sails. But it wasn't chaos alone that made Nelson's skin crawl, it was the feeling that the crew wasn't running from something they had seen, but from something they felt, something that pressed against the air itself. A force they didn't understand yet, but one that was growing stronger with every heartbeat. The fog shifted suddenly, curling inward as though drawn by invisible hands. Nelson took a step back, gripping the hilt of his knife even though he knew steel was useless against whatever was moving beneath them. He could hear it now, a slow, rhythmic thud, like a heartbeat echoing across the undercurrent of waves. It didn't belong to the ship. It didn't belong to any creature he knew. It felt alien, ancient, patient. "Midshipman Nelson," a voice called from the quarterdeck. "Up here, now." Nelson forced himself to move, weaving through terrified sailors as the deck slanted under his feet. Every step felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted him. When he reached the steps, another boom shook the ship, sending a spray of cold seawater over the bow. The impact nearly knocked him off balance, but he caught the railing and hauled himself upward. The quarterdeck was a frenzy of officers gathering around the captain, their faces pale, eyes reflecting the eerie glow rising from the swirling fog. Captain Suckling gripped the helm with white knuckles, barking orders that dissolved into the roar of wind and creaking timbers. Nelson stepped closer, trying to listen, but then the captain turned toward him, and the lines etched across his face told Nelson what no order could. He didn't know what was happening either. "Look there," the captain said quietly, pointing with a trembling finger toward the starboard side. Nelson followed his gaze, and for a moment, everything around him fell away. The fog was no longer shapeless. It spiraled into a vast column, rotating with slow, deliberate motion. Inside its swirling mass, shapes flickered, long slivers of shadow, twisting and sliding like serpents. And then he saw it, a faint, glowing outline rising from the water, impossibly tall, impossibly thin, as if something enormous lay just beneath the surface, brushing against the fog from below. Whatever it was moving closer. "What is it?" Nelson whispered. No one answered. No one could. Another officer clutched the rail, his breath shallow. "That thing, it followed us. I swear it did. Ever since sundown." The captain shot him a sharp look, but before he could respond, the ship lurched violently to port. Men toppled over one another. A rope snapped overhead, whipping across the deck with enough force to flay skin. The column of fog expanded, lowering itself, stretching toward them. A low hum vibrated through the air, so deep it made Nelson's teeth ache. The helmsman fought the wheel, but the ship wouldn't turn. It felt anchored by invisible weight. "Brace yourselves," Captain Suckling shouted. Nelson dropped to one knee just as the sea exploded on the starboard side. A towering wave slammed against the hull, sending water pouring across the deck. Men shouted and slipped, grabbing at anything to keep from being swept overboard. Another wave hit, then another, each higher and harder than the last. Yet the sky above remained strangely calm, no storm, no thunder, no reason for the sea to be behaving this way. This force was rising from below. Through the chaos, Nelson felt the officer who had spoken earlier grab his arm again. His voice shook as he leaned close. "It's not the French. Not pirates. Not a storm. This is something else. Something that shouldn't be here." Nelson opened his mouth to reply, but another scream cut him off, this time clearly human, raw with terror. It came from the foredeck. Nelson rushed toward the sound, fighting the tilt of the ship. When he reached the bow, he saw a cluster of sailors gathered around a man sprawled on the planks, trembling violently. His eyes were wide, staring at nothing, pupils blown wide with fear. "What happened?" Nelson demanded. "He saw something in the water," one of the sailors stammered. "Right beneath us. Huge, moving, watching." Nelson knelt beside the man, but the sailor only shook his head in small, frantic jerks, whispering the same word over and over. Below, below, below. The ship groaned deeply, as if something scraped its underside again, not like before, not a tap, but a long, dragging stroke, like claws trailing along the hull. Men froze. Even the wind seemed to pause. The humming grew louder, resonating through the mast and into Nelson's bones. He rose slowly, turning back toward the fog column. It was closer now. Much closer. He could make out the faint suggestion of multiple shapes shifting within it, silhouettes that moved too slowly, too deliberately, to be waves. The captain's voice rang out again from the quarterdeck, strained and breaking. All hands, prepare for impact. Impact? From what? The fog pulsed, brightening from within. Something enormous stirred beneath the waves, sending ripples that rocked the ship in steady, powerful intervals. Each pulse came faster than the last. Nelson's grip tightened on the railing. Whatever was rising from under the dark water wasn't a ship, wasn't a storm, and wasn't anything the Royal Navy had trained him to face. And as the fog parted just enough to reveal a deeper shadow rising upward, he realized with a chill that sank into his bones. They were no longer the hunters on the sea. They were the prey. The water rose straight up as if the sea itself had been split open. A towering column surged beside the ship, drenching the deck in a freezing cascade that knocked men off their feet and ripped ropes from their cleats. Nelson gasped as the cold hit him, but before he could recover, a shadow moved inside the great wall of water, vast, smooth, and unmistakably alive. No one spoke. No one dared. The wave crashed back into the sea with a roar that shook the ship's very spine. Nelson staggered to the rail and gripped it hard, his knuckles whitening. The water churned violently below, glowing with that same unearthly light pulsing from the fog. He searched for movement, for a shape, for anything that made sense. But the ocean writhed without form, as if something immense shifted just out of sight, circling them. A sailor beside him muttered a prayer. Another fell to his knees, shaking. Nelson's breath came shallow and uneven. He could feel something watching. The sensation had weight, a presence thick enough to press against his shoulders, the back of his neck, the space behind his heart. The kind of attention predators had when studying prey. Then, without warning, the ship jerked backward. Men screamed as they fell. Barrels toppled. Coils of rope slid across the deck. Nelson slammed into the mast, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. The ship kept pulling, backwards, as though an invisible hook had caught its stern and now dragged it through the dark like a toy. The sails flapped uselessly above, snapping in the wind with frantic energy. The helm spun violently. The helmsman tried to hold on, but the wheel tore free and spun on its own, rattling like bones in a drum. "We're being pulled," an officer shouted. "Something's dragging us." Dragged. Nelson felt the word twist deep inside him. Ships drifted, they were pushed by wind or tide, but they were not dragged. Not like this. Not by unseen hands. He forced himself upright and pushed toward the captain, who stood braced against the quarterdeck rail, eyes locked on the boiling sea astern. "What's doing this?" Nelson shouted over the roar. Captain Suckling didn't look at him. His jaw was clenched, his face pale. "Hold fast, Nelson. Whatever it is, it's not done with us." Another violent pull yanked the ship sideways. The deck tilted dangerously. Half the crew slid toward the starboard rail. Nelson grabbed a rope and held on as the ship heaved, groaning in pain like a wounded animal. For one terrifying moment, he thought they would capsize. Then, release. The ship snapped forward with such force that the mainmast cracked loudly, echoing across the night. Men lay sprawled in heaps, groaning and gasping. The deck swayed, but held. Nelson tried to catch his breath, the metallic tang of fear sitting heavy on his tongue. The fog column had vanished. He blinked, stunned. The great swirling pillar that had towered above them moments ago was simply gone, scattered into tatters drifting low across the sea like torn cloth. But the water still glowed, and the waves rose in strange, patterned shapes, like ripples from something enormous moving near the surface. "Midshipman," someone cried behind him. "Look portside." Nelson turned sharply. A line of light traced across the water, moving fast. It cut through the waves with unnatural precision, forming a perfect curve that bent inward toward the ship. Another line appeared beside it. Then a third. They moved like strokes of a giant quill, drawing circles around the vessel. The ocean was marking them. The captain saw it too. His voice cracked as he shouted, "All men armed. To positions. Now!" Sailors scrambled, grabbing muskets, boarding pikes, axes, anything they could carry. Nelson armed himself with a cutlass, even though he doubted blades would matter against something capable of reshaping fog and dragging a warship through the sea. A deep vibration thrummed beneath his boots. Then again. A third time, stronger. Nelson staggered as the entire ship shuddered from the force. The wood beneath him felt brittle, as if each pulse was weakening something vital. Another glow spread beneath the waves, larger this time, brighter, rising like dawn under the black water. Men backed away from the rail, faces ghost pale. Something was coming up. The sea bulged. Slowly. Deliberately. Not like a wave, not like a swell, but like the curved back of something colossal lifting from the depths. The bulge traveled in a wide arc toward the bow, disappearing into the fog. The ship rocked violently in its wake. Nelson's heartbeat picked up pace. Sweat slid down his temples despite the icy wind. The cutlass in his hand felt ridiculous now, a scrap of metal facing the impossible. Another bulge rose, this one much closer. Ripples spread outward. The glow intensified. The water hissed and steamed. Nelson took a step back, but the railing pressed into his spine. Men around him muttered in terror, some begging under their breath, others frozen with eyes wide and unblinking. The bulge broke the surface. Not fully, just a hint. A smooth arc of something dark, thicker than any creature's hide Nelson had ever seen, glistening with unnatural sheen. It curved upward, then slipped soundlessly beneath the waves again. But in that brief glimpse, Nelson felt a cold certainty lodge in his gut. That was not the body of one creature. It was the edge of something larger, far larger, moving beneath them. The sea around the ship erupted with shimmering trails of light, spirals and arcs crossing one another like glowing fingerprints stamped on the waves. The lines drew tighter, closer, almost touching the hull. Back! Nelson yelled. Away from the rail. Too late. The water surged upward again, rising in a tall, twisting column. But this time, something moved inside it, long, slender shapes coiling upward like limbs reaching toward the deck. Men screamed and scattered as one of the shapes slapped onto the planks with a wet crack, leaving a smear of bright, shimmering fluid that sizzled like acid. Nelson stared at the mark, breath frozen in his chest. The shape dragged itself back into the water and vanished. The glow deepened. The humming pulsed. And as the ship lurched violently once more, Nelson realized with dawning dread that whatever surrounded them wasn't attacking yet. It was probing. Studying. Choosing. The first man was taken so fast that no one realized he was gone until they heard the splash. One moment he stood at the rail, wide-eyed and trembling. The next, a blur of motion swept across the deck, and he vanished into the churning black below without even managing a scream. Nelson whipped around, heart seizing in his chest, but there was nothing to see, only the rippling glow fading beneath the waves, as if whatever claimed him had dissolved into the water itself. Panic erupted. Men stumbled back from the rail, colliding with one another, shouting over the roar of the wind and the low, rhythmic thrum vibrating through the hull. Nelson felt the vibration in his ribs, in his teeth, a steady pulse that seemed to sync with the pounding of his own blood. He wanted to shout orders, to calm the men, to do something. But his throat locked. His mind clawed for reason, for explanation, but there was none. Only the certainty that the danger wasn't over. It was escalating. The deck tilted sharply, sending several sailors sprawling. Another wave slammed against the hull, though the sky above remained eerily clear. Nelson grabbed a rope to steady himself and scanned the water, searching for movement. The glow beneath the surface shifted, swirling into deeper shades of blue and green. The patterns moved too precisely, not like drifting currents, not like the lazy motion of ocean life, but with intention. Captain Suckling shouted something from the quarterdeck, but his voice was drowned out by another deep groan from the ship itself, as though the Victory's wooden bones were bending under invisible pressure. Nelson pushed toward the captain, weaving through terrified sailors, but halfway across the deck, a sudden splash burst upward near the bow. A sailor screamed. One of the shimmering limbs, if it could be called that, slithered over the rail, scraping across the planks with a sound like wet stone dragged across metal. It was longer than a man, smooth and glistening, with faint pulsing veins of light running beneath its surface. It twitched, tasting the air. Nelson froze. The limb curled inward, almost sensing him. Before he could move, 2 Marines fired their muskets. Smoke exploded outward, gunpowder burning Nelson's nostrils. The shots hit the limb with a dull thud, and vanished. Swallowed. As if the creature absorbed the impact without injury. The glowing veins brightened. Then the limb slid back over the rail and disappeared into the sea, leaving behind only a slick, burning smear on the deck that hissed like boiling water. Men recoiled. One sailor tried to wipe it away with a rag, but the cloth began to smoke, and he threw it down with a cry. Whatever touched the ship wasn't just alive. It was corrosive. Nelson reached the captain, breath tight. Captain Suckling stood rigid, staring into the darkness beyond the stern as if wrestling with a decision no man should ever have to make. "Sir," Nelson said, forcing the word out. "What are your orders?" The captain didn't answer at first. His eyes tracked a new ripple forming behind the ship. No, not a ripple. A shape. Enormous. Rising slowly. "Hold position," the captain finally murmured, though his voice trembled. "We can't outrun it." Nelson swallowed hard. The admission chilled him more than the wind. If the captain believed escape was impossible, then whatever lurked below them was beyond the limits of any seamanship or sailcraft he'd ever known. The shape rose higher, pushing aside waves, forming a massive bulge in the water. Nelson thought for a moment it might break the surface entirely, that they would finally see what hunted them. But at the last second, it sank again, sliding beneath the ship with a long, shuddering groan that rattled every beam. Men stumbled as the deck vibrated. One fell to his knees, clutching his ears. Another backed against the mast, muttering prayers through clenched teeth. Nelson steadied himself against the rail and peered down. The light below intensified until the water looked like molten glass. Trails of luminescence spiraled outward, crossing and weaving like a vast, intricate diagram being drawn in real time. A symbol. A pattern. A trap. He didn't know what it meant, but every instinct screamed that the ship was being encircled, not at random, but with precise, calculated movements. Then the humming stopped. Completely. The abrupt silence struck harder than the noise. Nelson stiffened. Every man on deck froze. Even the wind seemed to falter, sails sagging slightly in the sudden stillness. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the ocean exhaled. A blast of cold air surged upward, followed by a deep rumble from the depths, not like thunder, not like shifting earth, but something between a growl and a distant, resonant moan. The water rose again, forming rings that expanded rapidly outward from the ship's hull. "Brace!" Nelson yelled, though he didn't know what for. The water around the ship erupted in dozens of glowing tendrils, not limbs, not quite, but currents of light that shot upward, brushing the hull, curling around ropes, snaking across the lower deck. Men screamed as the tendrils coiled around their ankles, slid across their arms, brushed their faces. One sailor fell backward as a tendril grazed his cheek. His skin blistered instantly, and he howled in agony. Nelson lunged toward him, dragging him away from the railing as more tendrils shot upward like living lightning. The captain shouted orders, desperate, frantic. Marines fired volley after volley into the water, each shot useless. The tendrils thickened, rising higher, brushing the gunwales, slithering across the deck like searching fingers. Then, all at once, they stopped. Frozen. Inches from the men. Suspended in the air, humming softly. Nelson's pulse hammered in his throat. Every muscle in his body tensed. The tendrils hovered, swaying gently, tasting the air. Choosing again. Nelson held his breath. The glowing patterns beneath the ship brightened further, forming a perfect circle around the vessel. And with chilling clarity, Nelson understood. Whatever trapped them wasn't probing anymore. It wasn't watching. It wasn't waiting. It was preparing. Blood dripped from my fingertips, but I had no memory of how it got there. For a moment I just stared, unable to tell whether the wetness belonged to me or something I had touched, or something that had touched me. The corridor around me seemed to pulse with a faint metallic hum, like the walls were breathing. Shadows stretched in unnatural shapes, bending as if aware of my presence. I kept moving because stopping felt like an invitation to something I wasn't ready to face. The floor vibrated under my boots, soft tremors that reminded me of distant footsteps, only these didn't fade. They circled, tightened, like whatever made them was choosing its moment. I pressed my back to the wall and listened, trying to isolate any pattern, but the echoes overlapped until they became a kind of whispered rhythm, almost words, almost commands. My pulse raced, and for the first time, I wondered if I was truly alone in this place or if I had simply been pretending to be. A cold gust flowed through the hall and extinguished the dim lights overhead one by one. Not the usual flicker of failing power, this felt deliberate, like unseen fingers snuffing out candles. Darkness swallowed everything except a dull glow leaking from the end of the corridor. I moved toward it, careful, slow, but driven by an instinct that felt older than reason. Maybe the glow meant an exit. Maybe it meant the opposite. I didn't know anymore. The closer I came, the more the air thickened. A low hum resonated in my bones, building into a vibration that tugged at something behind my eyes. It felt like a memory trying to surface, or a warning trying to break through. I pressed my palm against the wall to steady myself, but the surface shifted under my touch, rippling like liquid metal. I jerked back. The wall returned to solid form as if mocking me. Another sound rose behind me. Soft. Careful. Intentional. I forced myself to turn slowly, though every instinct screamed at me to run. The corridor stretched empty, but the air carried the lingering warmth of something that had been standing far too close. I backed away, refusing to give in to blind fear. I had come this far. I wasn't leaving without answers, or at least a way out. The faint glow ahead intensified and transformed into a narrow beam cutting down the center of the passage. My steps aligned with it without thought, as if I was being drawn forward by a thread wrapped around my ribs. With each pace, I felt a sensation like pressure building inside my chest, not painful but heavy, like I was carrying something I hadn't realized I'd picked up along the way. At the end of the hall, the light opened into a room I had never seen before, though some part of me recognized it. The ceiling arched like the inside of a giant ribcage, and pale blue light seeped from grooves carved into the walls. In the center stood a structure, metallic, organic, impossible to classify. It pulsed faintly, as if it had a heartbeat. I stepped closer. Something inside the structure stirred, responding to my presence. A thin line split open along its surface, widening slowly, almost invitingly. My mind screamed that this was wrong, dangerous, a trap built for someone exactly like me. But another voice whispered that this was the end I had been crawling toward since the beginning, even before I realized there was a beginning. A shadow flickered across the room. I spun, expecting a threat, preparing myself, but nothing emerged. Only the strange hum persisted, now synchronized with my heartbeat. I felt myself being pulled closer to the structure again, unable to resist. Then the line on its surface widened further, revealing a dark interior filled with swirling shapes that shifted like smoke trapped in water. The colors bent and folded into each other, creating patterns I couldn't decipher but felt deep inside me, like memories I'd forgotten I owned. My breath caught. Something in there knew me. A low echo reverberated through the room, forming syllables just beyond comprehension. The structure trembled. The shapes within it accelerated their spinning. And then, something stepped forward from inside, emerging as if peeling itself out of the darkness. I froze. It had my silhouette. My stance. My movements. But its surface shimmered like fractured glass reflecting 1,000 distorted versions of me. It raised its head slowly, and though I couldn't see a face, I felt its gaze cut through me. My pulse hammered. My feet rooted to the ground. It stepped closer. The air between us twisted, distorting, bending sound and thought alike. I tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, who it was, why it existed, but my voice abandoned me. The figure halted an arm's length away, tilting its head as if examining a fragile specimen. Then it raised its hand. My heartbeat stuttered. Its palm hovered inches from my chest, and a surge of pressure rippled through the room. My surroundings blurred, the walls bending into a vortex of light and shadow. My lungs seized. I felt something tugging at me, pulling not my body, but something deeper, something essential. The figure leaned close, and I heard it breathe, not air, but a sound like 1,000 hushed voices exhaling at once. My vision dimmed. The structure behind it roared to life, blinding light pouring out, wrapping around us both. The pull intensified. I felt myself unraveling, dissolving, merging. Then everything stopped. Silence fell so absolute it felt like a physical blow. The light collapsed back into the structure. The figure stood motionless. My chest heaved, desperate for breath. And then, slowly, impossibly, the figure spoke with my voice. "This is only the beginning." My voice echoed back at me from a mouth that wasn't mine. The room trembled the moment the words settled into the air, as though the walls themselves recognized what stood before me. My legs threatened to give out, but I held my stance, unwilling to let fear decide my next movement. The other version of me, if that's even what it was, tilted its head with a quiet curiosity that felt more threatening than any weapon. The hum in the chamber deepened. Something unseen shifted in the walls, like giant gears turning behind thin metal skin. A cold wind spiraled upward, carrying the faint scent of burnt wires. My double took a single step toward me, and the ground beneath us rippled in response, as if the floor were nothing more than stretched membrane. I wanted to speak again, to reclaim my voice, but the moment I inhaled, the air thickened and clung to my throat. The pressure from the structure behind the figure pulsed like a heartbeat, and for one suffocating second, I wondered if it was syncing with mine, or trying to override it. The figure raised its hand, mirroring a gesture I hadn't made. It was not imitation, it was something deeper, something invasive, like it was reaching into the rhythm of my movements before I even formed them. I stepped backward. It stepped forward. My breath hitched, and the cold realization struck me, it wasn't copying me anymore. It was guiding me. A flicker of light shot through the chamber, slicing the shadows apart. The walls seemed to expand outward into an endless void, leaving only the structure, the figure, and myself suspended in a shifting, half-formed space. The ground vibrated, and a low resonance crawled up my spine. "You shouldn't be here," I managed to force out, though my words were weak, more plea than accusation. The figure paused, as though considering the sentence, and then the fragments making up its body began to rotate, shifting angles, revealing flashes of something behind the glass-like exterior. Not organs, not machinery, something else entirely, something that moved with intention. It didn't speak. Not with sound. Instead, the room itself answered. A deep rumble echoed everywhere at once, vibrating through my bones. The chamber's walls flickered through images, fractured memories of mine, distorted and rearranged. Moments I recognized. Moments I didn't. Moments that hadn't happened yet. They bled into each other, forming a mosaic of my life, and a life that wasn't mine. I staggered backward, but the space gave way beneath me, stretching like a thin sheet pulled to its limit. Darkness opened below, swirling with faint streaks of light. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to fall forward into it, because some part of me sensed that was exactly what the room wanted. The figure extended its arm again. But this time, instead of approaching, it touched the air beside it. A seam split open in the darkness, glowing with the same eerie light as the structure behind us. The glow expanded, shaping into a doorway, or something pretending to be one. My pulse hammered. A path out. A trap. A test. I didn't know, and that ignorance tightened around me like a noose. The figure stepped aside, leaving the doorway unguarded. It wasn't commanding me. It was offering. The hum in the chamber intensified until the air buzzed against my skin. I could feel a pull from the doorway, but it wasn't physical. It tugged at the edges of my mind, whispering something just out of reach. Possibility. Escape. Revelation. I took one step toward it, unable to resist the gravity of the unknown. The figure watched, silent, motionless, its fractured surface shimmering with shifting reflections. Each glimmer showed a different version of me, some familiar, some foreign, some horrifying. The doorway pulsed once and contracted sharply, like a heartbeat. I stopped. A sudden cold wrapped around my shoulders, heavy enough to freeze my breath halfway through my lungs. The chamber dimmed. The figure raised its head slowly, and the reflection stuttered before aligning into a single image. Me. Not the me standing there. A version older. Tired. Eyes hollow with something I didn't understand but instinctively feared. That reflection mouthed a single word, one I couldn't hear but felt carve into my bones. Run. The doorway snapped wider, releasing a burst of pressure that shoved me backward. My hands scraped against the trembling floor. The figure stepped forward, blocking the doorway completely, no longer offering but denying. The rumbling deepened, and cracks snaked across the ground, spilling lines of pale blue light. The chamber shuddered violently. The structure behind the figure began splitting open, its interior twisting and folding like a living void trying to escape its own vessel. I could feel my choices thinning, compressing into a single point. The figure extended both arms, and the fragments composing its body began to spin faster, emitting a sharp, buzzing frequency. My vision blurred at the edges. The pressure in my skull built until every heartbeat felt like a hammer blow. I forced myself to stand. The room lurched sideways. I braced, fought the tilt, fought the collapsing sense of reality twisting around me. I didn't know what the figure wanted, but whatever waited behind it, inside that structure, felt infinitely worse. Then the walls shattered into darkness. The chamber vanished. I found myself on a narrow platform stretching into endless shadow. Wind roared below, carrying faint echoes, my voice, my memories, my fear, all bleeding together into a sound I couldn't escape. The platform shook, pieces crumbling into the abyss. The figure stood at the opposite end. Its surface no longer reflected me. Instead, it pulsed with something alive, something aware. I took a step forward. The platform groaned. The abyss hissed. The figure mirrored me again, but slowly, deliberately, choosing each motion as though deciding what kind of ending this would be. A final gust of air surged upward, lifting dust and fragments around us. I clenched my fists. I wouldn't run. Not from this. Not now. The platform's edges cracked, trembling under the weight of a choice I hadn't yet made. The figure leaned forward. The abyss roared. And then, with a voice that vibrated through the air like a collapsing star, it spoke again. You were never meant to leave. The words slammed into me, and the platform split beneath my feet. But before I fell, a blinding light erupted behind the figure, swallowing everything in its path. And everything went silent.